Hi friends, and thanks for clicking on this video. Today, I thought it would be fun to look at some TikTok crochet and general fiber arts hot takes and tips. I actually deleted TikTok maybe about a month ago, so I haven't really been on there recently, but I did want to check out what, the current crochet trends are, what people are talking about, and if there are any ways to possibly improve my own crochet. Now, before we begin, I want to get into the proper attire. Now, I feel like these glasses are giving more critique, connoisseur, if you will. Not that I'm a connoisseur of crocheting at all, but I just think these are a fun wardrobe change for when I'm doing videos like these. I don't know. Part of it was just me wanting to show off my new glasses, honestly. Like, aren't they a fun color? Anyway, let's look at some TikToks.
My crochet hot take. I do not understand the hype of the clover hooks. Prim hooks reign supreme. They're longer, they're pointier.
Okay, I don't understand the hype of getting like specific crochet brands. Personally, I just tend to crochet with hooks that I find randomly. I've been crocheting with like those basic metal aluminum hooks for most of my life. Now, granted, I don't think those are the best for you ergonomically, but I think they're pretty decent. I'll show a picture of what I typically crochet with, but I don't want people to think that they need to buy specific hooks in order to crochet better and things like that. As long as it's the right thickness, then you're good to go. But of course, I understand that ergonomically and things like that, people have other preferences.
They're all over so much better. What's your favorite hook? Let me know down in the comments.
I do prefer a longer hook though, so I understand what she's talking about. I should check these hooks out though. I've honestly never heard of them. I'm not really super into like the crochet sphere where I'm familiar with certain brands and things like that.
Look at this. Perfect.
Okay, I've seen like a lot of discussion about this actually, even though this TikTok doesn't have that many views, but I have seen a lot of people talk about hot glue and things like that, particularly over on Reddit. I feel like people on there are very passionate about this discussion. Now, I personally don't think hot glue is cheating. I have personally used just normal glue, not even hot glue, to stick things on. I think people in the comments tend to agree. For example, this person says it's not cheating, but I say only do it if it's for yourself. If it's for someone else, crochet it on. I think I agree with that because in general, hot glue and normal glue isn't going to last forever. Also, if it's a garment or something you expect them to wash, then I definitely wouldn't suggest hot glue because it is likely that it'll fall off. But I also don't think people should be shamed for doing it. Like sewing things on takes forever. I think it tends to be my least favorite part and it tends to turn me away or turn me off from projects. So if hot gluing is gonna make or break your situation, then just hot glue something on, honestly. Like who cares? There are no explicit rules really. But yeah, I guess if you're selling something or it's something that you intend is going to be washed frequently, like a garment or apparel, then maybe not hot glue or glue in general. But there are other options too, like fusible interfacing, which I think doesn't wash away. I'm not 100% sure about that. But yeah, I feel like this is a pretty controversial topic. I don't know though. Let me know what you guys think.
After more than 20 years of crocheting, I recently learned a way to finish your stitch that is a complete game changer. Instead of doing a regular stitch and making a knot that's bulky and hard to hide, clip your yarn, leaving an extra long tail, and pull it all the way up through your last stitch. Then you will thread your yarn through the top stitch of the last round and again through your very last stitch. Pull the yarn through until it joins both rounds seamlessly.
I have actually seen this tip a lot. I've seen it on Pinterest and I've also seen it on Xiaohongshu. If you don't know what Xiaohongshu is, it's a Chinese social media platform. I made a video about it a while ago, but you can click over here if you're interested in checking that out. But anyway, this does really seem to join granny squares in a very seamless and nice way. Let's see how she ends up like weaving in the ends and stuff like that.
Then weave the tail in through the stitches on the back side of your project. Now there are no bulky knots and you have a seamless finish all the way around.
Okay, so it just looks like she weaves it into the back, which very valid. I do that when I tie the knot that she's talking about. I think this is a good tip. For me personally, whenever I'm making granny squares, it's typically because I'm going to be sewing them together. And so I feel like if I'm sewing them together, that bulkiness that she's talking about doesn't really end up mattering in the end. Also, I'm someone who gets really paranoid about my yarn unraveling, so I just wouldn't feel good about not tying a knot in the end. Maybe she ties a knot at some point, like maybe after weaving it in, I don't know. But I do understand why someone would want to do this if they're creating granny squares for coasters maybe, and so that way that knot isn't like bulky and it's not sticking out, and then you can just very seamlessly weave it in. Overall though, I've seen this tip and it is really popular. It does seem like a really pretty solution for having super pristine seamless squares. On to the next one.
So I crocheted this to look like it was knitted because I do not know how to knit.
That is a beautiful pattern, unrelated, but let's keep going.
So here's how I did it. Okay, so the way it works is you're just doing single crochets actually. So normally you would go in here to do a single crochet, right? But instead you're going into this V that's kind of attached to a single crochet. So I'm just gonna go into here and do a single crochet.
It's interesting that she uses like the very tippy tip of her crochet like hook, the part of the hook, to get into the hole. Sometimes I do that when a crochet loop or hole is too tight. I just thought that was funny because I do that too.
Crochet, and I'll show you again. And normally you're not going here, you're going into this V, right? And you want to make sure you're pulling up a little bit more than a normal single crochet. It just makes it easier to get into the V on the next round. You also want to make sure you're using a hook 2 sizes bigger than your yarn. So this yarn is meant for a 3mm hook. I'm using a 5mm hook. And then also you can only work the front side with this stitch. If you can't really work into the back of them because the V's are upside down. They're like mountains instead of V's. So you either have to work in a circle like I am, or you would have to work across and then detach your yarn and reattach it and work across.
That's so interesting. I've seen a lot of different techniques out there of people trying to make crochet look like knit garments. I understand why. Sometimes knit garments, they just give you that certain vibe. You like the look of them more. And I think this is quite a creative solution. It totally does look like it's knit. You can see all those little V's that she's talking about that are pretty much exclusive to knit garments. The fact that you can only work in the round or only work on one side is kind of frustrating, but I guess if you're making a garment like she is, where you're going to be working in the round anyway, that doesn't really matter that much. I think it's really interesting that the hook size is so much bigger than the recommended size, and also that she's purposefully using a larger tension, which is what she's talking about when she's saying that she's pulling up. I think that's interesting too, because in the end, even though she's doing all these things, it looks like really tight. I'm also curious to know if this technique uses up more or less yarn, because if you don't know, single crochet is pretty dense and uses up a lot more yarn in comparison to something like double crocheting, and knitting is a lot less dense and also uses less yarn. So I'm curious if this technique uses up the same amount of yarn as knitting, or maybe less or more. I don't know. That would be interesting to see like how dense the garment ends up being in the end. But very beautiful piece and a very cool tip. Maybe I'll try that in the future.
Here is my crochet hot take for the day. I actually don't care if people confuse crocheting and knitting. I think the average person doesn't really know the difference, and it doesn't really matter that much to me.
You might know this creator. I know that they're pretty popular on YouTube, and it seems like they're popular on TikTok as well. But I honestly agree with this. Like, why would it matter if someone confused crocheting and knitting? I think the only instance where it would be good to know if something is crocheted is if you're buying it from a fast fashion type of store. If you don't know, crochet items can't be made with a machine, whereas knit items can be made with a machine. So if you find a crochet item that's maybe only like 20, 30, even $40, someone made that entirely by hand, and you just know that they are not getting paid well. Unfortunately, this is the case with any fast fashion brand, honestly. Even if something is knit, the person who made that garment probably isn't being treated well or compensated well for their work. But I do see a lot of people talk about this with crochet specifically. And so if you're the average consumer and you don't know the difference between knit and crochet, that could be something to look out for if you're into like shopping sustainably or shopping ethically. No hate to people who buy from like fast fashion brands or anything though. I do that too, but you know, just something to keep in mind if you're interested in that.
I'm usually just happy that someone wants to start a conversation about what I'm making, or they're interested at all in crafting. Knitting is 2 needles and crochet is 1 hook. but a lot of people don't know that, and that's okay.
I totally agree. If someone sees me crocheting or knitting and they ask me what I'm doing, there's no reason to make a big deal out of them not knowing the difference between one or the other. In case you do want to be able to tell the difference when you're looking at garments though, typically knit garments have those V shapes like you saw in the last TikTok, whereas crochet garments don't. Crochet garments, even though there are so many different types of stitches with those, don't tend to have that V-like structure. And also when you see crochet garments out and about, they're usually used in like a granny square context. So usually if you see something made of granny squares, like any of these types of things, those are usually crocheted. Even though I think I have seen a type of like knit variety of granny squares. I don't know, one time I was looking at something that was a granny square and it totally did not look crocheted. It looked knit, and I thought that was really interesting. But anyway, in general, that's typically how you can tell the difference if you are curious about that.
In my opinion, I think it is very pick-me type of behavior whenever I see any of those fiber arts hot takes videos, and then it's like from somebody who predominantly knits, or they're like knitting on camera, and then they're like, my first hot take, I think that crochet wearables are all fugly. First and foremost, I feel like that take is freezing ice cold. Okay, I've heard that take since before I even ever started crocheting.
I have heard this take too. I think I have seen a lot of people talk about how crochet items don't look as good as knit items. People are discussing this in the comments of this creator's video. By the way, I love this creator. She has lots of amazing videos on YouTube. But anyway, people are saying people don't typically like crochet clothes because they're a little bulkier. But I think that's usually because people aren't using the right yarn thickness or the right hook. Now, statistically, crochet does use up more yarn than knitting. Even if you do use a thinner type of yarn, you'll usually end up needing more yarn when you're crocheting than when you're knitting. And so again, typically crochet items do tend to end up being a little bulkier or heavier, but there are lots of ways to mitigate that. And you know, it's okay if crochet garments aren't for you, or if you just think knit garments look better. But yeah, there's no need to yuck someone's yum, you know, make fun of someone for liking one over the other or whatever.
Secondly, I feel like if you have the opinion that all crochet wearables are ugly, perhaps maybe pause and think that you just do not know how to crochet wearables. Like, there are so many crochet stitches that are wonderfully drapey and are perfect for garments. And don't get me wrong, I love knitting. I started off knitting before I ever started crocheting. I respect and admire people who knit. I respect and admire knitting as a hobby, craft, and art form just as much as I form hobby and craft. And you are entitled to your own opinions. If you still think at the end of the day that knitting looks better than crochet, cool, we can talk about that. But I think it's weird to have to degrade an entire craft, art, hobby that many people partake in and enjoy and love.
Totally agree with this take. If you like one over the other, you can have a discussion about that, but no reason to degrade anyone. But anyway, yeah, crochet garments, they're cool. I like them, but I do understand why some people prefer knit ones too.
This might be a hot take, but the same people that complain about a $7 crochet pattern are also the same people that without hesitation will pay $30+ for a single DoorDash meal. These are the same people that spend $10 a day on a nice latte. Your crochet patterns aren't expensive, they just don't value your work.
I feel like this is the first like actual hot take in this video. I'm reading through the comments and a lot of people are agreeing, disagreeing. There is some discussion. For me, I think $7 is worth it for a pattern, but I think it also depends on what that pattern is. If it's maybe a bandana, which is like a small item, there's plenty of free tutorials online for that. I think maybe $7 would be a little expensive. But if it's for something like a cardigan, you know, there's different size variations in that pattern. Maybe it has an interesting motif or something like that. Then I think $7 is perfectly appropriate, if not maybe even too cheap for something like that. And this creator does make the argument that, you know, you're buying a product from a small business, and when you're buying something like a pattern from someone, that's how they make rent. That's how they pay for food, they pay for their bills using that kind of money. So I do understand why people charge certain amounts for patterns. I think for a lot of fiber art creators, this is how they make a majority of their income. I could totally be wrong about that because I am not someone who sells anything crochet related. But yeah, it just seems like patterns are a really big source of income for these small creators or small businesses, so I understand why they would charge $7 or even more for a pattern. My gripes usually come with when it's a pattern that just exists free everywhere online. It's like, okay, I guess you can charge that, no big deal, but you know, I can find this if I just do a quick Google search. But at the same time, I don't understand why consumers would be upset about any small business overcharging. Like, you totally have the freedom to just not buy that item and go about your day. So I think being upset about small businesses overcharging in general isn't that big of a deal. Again, you have the option to just not buy that item. Maybe that's a hot take from me. I don't know. Anyways, on to the next one.
I need someone else who crochets to tell me if I'm crazy for this. So I've been crocheting for over 10 years now, and I've never made a magic ring. I've heard the term magic ring before, I know what it's for, but I could not tell you how to make one or what it looks like. Whenever I see in a crochet,
I think a lot of people tend to struggle with magic rings. I don't really know why. I don't think they're that hard. I have been crocheting for about 10 years too, or I don't know how long it's been. But I came across magic rings like pretty late. I didn't know what they were, but when I found out about them, I was like, oh, this is cool. I can understand why people find them hard. I don't think they're that hard. But let's see what technique she does instead.
crochet pattern to do a magic ring, this is what I'm doing. So let's say a crochet pattern started off with make a magic ring and single crochet 6 into the magic ring. All I would do is I would make a slip knot. I would just chain 2 and right into the
Oh my gosh, before we even go into how she does this, the way she crochets is so unique. She crochets almost as if she's knitting. I've never seen someone do that before. That's so interesting.
right into the second chain from hook, I'm gonna single crochet 6. And then when I'm done, I'm just gonna pull this and I'll slip stitch into my first single crochet. And that's what I would do.
That's pretty cool. I think that works perfectly fine. I'm of the notion that you don't need to do a magic ring if you don't want to. If you want to chain 2, do that. I've seen people chain 4, you can do that. Although I personally think chaining 4 does leave a little bit of a hole in the center, but to each their own. Again, there are no rules when it comes to crocheting. I think it would be pretty snobby if you told someone, oh, you didn't make that with a magic ring, that's wrong. Like, no, it doesn't really matter. In the end, you get the same end result anyway. I understand why magic rings are sometimes useful though. I know that in like amigurumi, for example, it's nice to have that magic ring so you can have that really tight, taut like center, but I totally agree, it's not always necessary. For example, this person says they do the chain 2 method for like chunky and fluffy yarn because it shreds. That's a really good point. Sometimes it's really hard to tug your yarn when you do a magic ring, especially if it's textured yarn. So honestly, just do what works for you. I don't really understand those magic ring purists anyway either. I think that's a good one to end on. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and learned some new crochet things or got to see some current crochet hot takes. If you like videos like these, please let me know. I'd love to make a second part for you guys maybe. As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye!